The dust swirled, a bitter grit clinging to the back of Elara's throat, each particle a tiny stone of despair. Her son, Tom, small and fierce despite the hollows in his cheeks, pressed against her left side, his small hand clutching a fold of her ragged skirt. Sarah, her daughter, a shadow of the girl she once was, leaned into her right, her breathing shallow, a bird's wing fluttering against Elara's ribs. The air itself was a judgment, thick with the unvoiced contempt of the assembled townsfolk. They stood apart, a loose circle of faded calico and worn denim, faces hard as the packed earth under their boots. Preacher Gideon was there, his Bible held like a shield, or perhaps a weapon, his gaze sweeping over Elara and her children with a righteousness that scorched. Mayor Thorne, a man whose girth spoke of comforts Elara could no longer imagine, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes avoiding hers. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like unoiled gears, had already dispensed with the meager remnants of their previous life, a chipped pitcher, a threadbare blanket, a dented tin pot. Now, only they remained. The silence stretched, taut and cruel. Then, a man stepped forward from the edge of the sparse crowd, detaching himself from the anonymity of the trees where he'd been watching. Elias Thorne. No relation to the mayor, a fact the mayor was always quick to point out. Elias was a name spoken in whispers, a man of the harsh, unforgiving land that bordered the town, a recluse who kept to his acres and his own counsel. He was tall, weathered like an old fence post, his face a map of sun and wind and sorrows unspoken. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Elara, not with the leering curiosity of some, nor the cold condemnation of others, but with an unnerving stillness, a deep, unreadable appraisal. He didn't speak. He rarely did. The auctioneer, sensing a shift, a potential if unorthodox transaction, cleared his throat. Well now, Elias. Didn't expect to see you gracing us. Anything here catch your eye? His attempt at jocularity fell flat, absorbed by the somber mood. Elias's gaze moved from Elara to Tom, then to Sarah, a flicker in their depths, too quick to name. Shame, hot and suffocating, rose in Elara. She had nothing left. Nothing but the raw, aching core of her motherhood. The thought, desperate and profane, had been coiling in her mind for days, a serpent offering a bitter apple. She looked at her children, at Tom's defiant chin already trembling, at Sarah's eyes, wide with a terror that mirrored her own. The wind, a mournful sigh through the pines, seemed to whisper the words for her. She took a ragged breath, the dust a familiar torment. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp, torn from a place of ultimate surrender. She looked directly at Elias Thorne, meeting that still, grey gaze. I belong to you now, Master, if you'll show my kids mercy. The word master was ash in her mouth, a degradation she offered up like a sacrifice. The assembled townsfolk stirred, a collective gasp, a rustle of shock and morbid fascination. Preacher Gideon's lips thinned, his hand tightening on his Bible. Mayor Thorne actually took a step back. Elias did not react. His expression remained unchanged, his stillness absolute. He simply looked at her, then at the children, his gaze lingering on their small, frightened faces. The silence returned, heavier now, pregnant with the weight of her words, with the unspoken futures hanging in the balance. Tom's grip tightened on her skirt until his knuckles were white. Sarah burrowed closer, a small, shivering animal seeking refuge. Elara held her breath, her heart a trapped thing beating against her ribs. The sun beat down, merciless. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry earth and something else, something akin to a final, desperate prayer. Elias Thorne finally moved. He took a slow step towards them, then another. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes, those winter sky eyes, held hers. He didn't speak. He merely nodded, a single, almost imperceptible inclination of his head. Then he turned, his back to the stunned town, and began to walk towards the rutted track that led away from the settlement, towards the wild, untamed land that was his. He didn't look back to see if they followed. He didn't need to. Elara let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was done. She touched Tom's head, then Sarah's. Come, she whispered, her voice still raw. We go with him. She didn't know if it was rescue or a different kind of ruin, but it was a step away from the open condemnation of the town. It was, for now, the only mercy offered. The journey to Elias Thorne's ranch was made in silence, a silence as vast and unyielding as the landscape they traversed. The track was rough, little more than 2 faint lines carved into the resistant earth, winding upwards into hills cloaked in sambar pine and skeletal aspen. Elias walked ahead, his stride long and unhurried, never once looking back. Elara followed, Tom's hand now firmly in hers, Sarah stumbling occasionally beside her, her small face pale with exhaustion and fear. The sun climbed, then began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood and bruised purple. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp scent of an approaching autumn. Elara's thin shawl offered little protection against the chill that seeped into her bones, a chill that mirrored the one in her heart. She watched Elias's back, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with hardship. He carried nothing but a small, worn satchel, yet he seemed to possess the very ground he walked upon. He didn't speak, not a word of guidance, not a word of reassurance. His silence was a heavy blanket, smothering the questions that churned within her. What manner of man was this? What did he expect of her, of them? The word master echoed in her mind, a brand she had seared upon herself. Would he exact the price of her desperate bargain? The children were near their limit. Tom, though he tried to be brave, stumbled more frequently, his small legs struggling to keep pace. Sarah's earlier whimpers had subsided into a weary, listless quiet. Elara's own body ached, her feet were raw, but she pushed onward, driven by the fragile hope that this path, however bleak, led away from a worse fate. As dusk deepened, casting long, eerie shadows that danced like spectres among the trees, they rounded a bend, and there it was. Not a ranch in the sprawling, prosperous sense she might have once imagined, but a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a shallow valley, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. A rough-hewn fence enclosed a small paddock where a single, gaunt horse stood, its head low. The land around was wild, untamed, the forest pressing close on 3 sides. It was a place of profound isolation, a place where a man could disappear or be forgotten. Elias reached the cabin door, a simple plank affair, and pushed it open without breaking stride. He gestured vaguely inwards, a silent invitation, or perhaps an order. Elara hesitated for a moment, peering into the dim interior. Then, with a gentle pressure on Tom's shoulder, she urged her children forward. Inside, a fire already burned low in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough log walls. The cabin was small, a single room, sparsely furnished. A crude table and 2 benches stood in the center. A narrow cot was tucked into one corner, a pile of furs in another. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a faint, lingering scent of something else, herbs, perhaps, or dried flowers, a ghostly trace of a life lived here before. Elias moved to the hearth, adding a few small logs to the fire. The flames leaped, momentarily illuminating his face, revealing lines of weariness, of a sorrow so deep it seemed etched into his very bones. He still didn't speak. He took 3 wooden bowls from a rough shelf, a ladle, and a blackened pot that hung by the fire. He ladled a thin stew into each bowl, then placed them on the table. He gestured again, towards the food, towards the benches. Elara guided the children to the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood, the crackle of the fire, the mournful sigh of the wind outside the cabin walls. The stew was simple, broth, a few vegetables, a hint of wild game, but it was warm, and it filled the aching emptiness in their stomachs. Elara watched Elias. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze mostly on the fire. He seemed oblivious to their presence, yet his actions, the fire, the food, were a form of communication, a stark, practical provision. When they had finished, he took their empty bowls without a word, rinsed them in a bucket of water by the door, and set them aside. He then indicated the pile of furs. For them, he said, his voice raspy from disuse, the first words he had spoken directly to her since his single nod in town. It was not unkind. It was merely a statement. Ilara settled the children onto the furs. They were exhausted, asleep almost before their heads touched the soft animal skins. She pulled a ragged blanket from the pile over them, her hand lingering on Sarah's hair, then Tom's small, clenched fist. She turned back to the room. Elias was already on the narrow cot, his back to her, a still shape under a dark blanket. The firelight played over the rough walls, the deep shadows. She was alone with this silent, enigmatic man, in this isolated cabin, her future an unwritten page. She didn't know what the night would bring, or the dawn. She only knew the cold knot of fear in her belly, and the fading warmth of the fire. She didn't flinch. She sat on the hard bench, her back straight, and waited for morning, a sentinel guarding her sleeping children in the heart of an uncertain wilderness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of survival, a rhythm measured in silence and unspoken understandings. Elias Thorne rose before dawn, the faint sounds of his movements, the stir of ashes in the hearth, the creak of the door, pulling Ilara from her light, watchful doze on the hard bench. He would already be gone when she coaxed the children awake, tending to tasks beyond the cabin's immediate orbit, checking snares, mending fences, or simply disappearing into the vast, indifferent wilderness that was his domain. He left food, a hunk of dark bread, a piece of dried meat, sometimes a small pail of goat's milk from a scrawny animal tethered behind the cabin. He didn't speak of it. It was simply there. Ilara, in turn, began to impose a fragile order on their corner of the small cabin. She swept the packed earth floor with a crude broom she found propped outside. She aired the furs in the thin morning sun. She washed their few clothes in the icy stream that ran near the cabin, her hands turning red and numb, the fabric freezing stiff as she hung it on low branches. The children, after the initial shock and terror, began to explore their constricted world with the resilience of the young. Tom, his initial defiance slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity, would watch Elias from a distance when the man was near the cabin, his small brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah, quieter and more timid, clung to Ilara's skirts, but her eyes, large and observant, missed nothing. She would collect smooth stones from the creek bed, arranging them in careful patterns on the cabin floor, her own silent language. Communication with Elias remained almost entirely nonverbal. A gesture towards the woodpile meant it needed replenishing. A glance at the water bucket was a request for it to be filled. Ilara learned to read these subtle cues, to anticipate his needs, moving quietly about the tasks that seemed to fall to her. She mended a tear in his rough wool shirt, using a needle and thread she found tucked away in a small wooden box, her stitches neat and even. When he returned that evening, he picked up the mended shirt, examined the stitches for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. But the next day, a small, slightly dented tin of tea leaves appeared on the shelf. Ilara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. It wasn't kindness as she had ever known it, not soft or effusive. It was a practical acknowledgement, a stark reciprocity. He provided, she contributed. The balance was harsh, but it was there. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, choked with weeds but showing signs of past cultivation. Hesitantly, she began to clear it, her hands raw from pulling at the stubborn roots. Elias watched her one afternoon, his arms crossed, leaning against the cabin wall. He didn't speak, didn't offer to help, but he didn't stop her either. The following morning, a rusty hoe and a small, pointed spade lay beside the cleared patch. Ilara's heart gave a small, unsteady leap. She worked the soil, the rhythmic chop of the hoe a counterpoint to the sigh of the wind in the pines. Tom, emboldened, began to help, his small hands pulling at the smaller weeds, his face serious with purpose. Sarah sat nearby, arranging her stones into the shape of a flower. The land was hard, unforgiving, but it yielded. It promised. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew crisp with the true bite of autumn, Elias returned with a young rabbit, limp in his hand. He skinned and cleaned it with practiced efficiency, then spitted it over the fire. The aroma of roasting meat filled the small cabin, a rich, savory scent that made their stomachs clench with anticipation. He carved the choicest portions for the children, then for Ilara, before taking his own. They ate, as always, in silence. But the silence felt different tonight, less heavy, less fraught. It was the silence of shared effort, of a meal earned from the resistant land. After they had eaten, Elias sat by the fire, not on his cot, but on one of the benches. He took a piece of softwood from his satchel and a small, sharp knife. Slowly, patiently, he began to carve. Ilara watched him, her hands idle in her lap. The firelight danced on his weathered face, softening the harsh lines, revealing a deep, indwelling melancholy. He wasn't looking at her, or the children. He was focused on the wood, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft as they shaped the small block. The shavings fell like snowflakes onto the hearth. Tom, drawn by the quiet activity, crept closer, his eyes wide. Elias didn't acknowledge him, but he didn't send him away. He simply continued to carve, the only sounds the scrape of the knife, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind that seemed to press against the cabin walls, a wild thing excluded from the small circle of warmth within. The carving became a nightly ritual. Elias would sit by the fire, the knife moving with a slow, deliberate grace, and from the wood, small figures would emerge, a bird with outstretched wings, a sturdy little horse, a watchful owl. He never offered them to the children directly. He would simply leave them on the hearth when he was done, and in the morning, Tom or Sarah would find them, their small faces lit with a quiet wonder. These small, unadorned tokens were treasures in their barren world. Sarah kept the bird clutched in her hand, its wooden form growing smooth from her touch. Tom lined up the horse and owl on a shelf Ilara had cleared for him. They were more than toys, they were silent messages, tangible evidence of a presence that, while still distant, was not entirely indifferent. Ilara continued her work in the small garden patch. The earth, though stubborn, began to yield. Tiny green shoots pushed through the dark soil, a promise of sustenance. She found a wild raspberry cane clinging to life at the edge of the forest and carefully transplanted its runners, hoping for a future sweetness. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with earth, but there was a satisfaction in the ache of her muscles, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She was not just surviving, she was contributing, tending, building something, however small, against the encroaching wilderness. One afternoon, while Elias was away, a tremor of the old fear returned. A lone rider appeared at the edge of the trees, pausing to survey the cabin. It wasn't a townsman Ilara recognized, but a stranger, his face hard and shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. Ilara quickly pulled the children inside, her heart hammering. The rider watched the cabin for a long moment, then, without approaching, turned his horse and disappeared back into the forest. The incident left her shaken. The isolation of the ranch, once a source of uneasy peace, now felt like a vulnerability. They were far from any help, at the mercy of any who might find them. When Elias returned at dusk, she didn't speak of the rider. She didn't know how. What words could convey the chilling certainty of that predatory gaze? But he seemed to sense her unease. He walked the perimeter of the small clearing, his eye scanning the tree line, his hand resting on the handle of the knife he always wore at his belt. He didn't speak. But his quiet vigilance was a reassurance. The trips to town for supplies were an ordeal Ilara dreaded but knew were necessary. Elias would go alone sometimes, but occasionally he would take the old cart, pulled by the gaunt horse, and she knew she and the children were expected to accompany him, perhaps as a silent statement of their presence, their belonging to his household. On one such trip, as they navigated the main street of the settlement, Preacher Gideon emerged from the general store, his path intersecting theirs. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering on Ilara with open disapproval. "Thorn," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. Still harboring this situation. Elias reined in the horse, his face impassive. He didn't speak. "The good Lord sees all, Thorn," Gideon continued, his voice rising in sanctimony. "He sees the sin that festers in darkness, the perversion of his natural order. This woman, these children, they are a blight." Ilara flinched, pulling her shawl tighter, trying to shield the children from the venom in his words. Tom, however, stood straighter, his small fists clenched, his gaze fixed on the preacher with a surprising fierceness. Sarah hid her face in Ilara's skirt. Elias finally turned his head, his winter sky eyes meeting Gideon's. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a growl, yet it cut through the preacher's rhetoric like a blade. "They are under my roof, preacher. My concern. Not yours." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. But the finality in his tone was absolute. Preacher Gideon's face flushed. He opened his mouth as if to retort, then seemed to think better of it. He gave a curt, angry nod and swept past them, his Bible clutched tightly. The encounter left a bitter taste. The town's judgment was a constant, looming shadow. But Elias's quiet defense, his simple declaration of "my roof, my concern," resonated deeply within Ilara. It wasn't a declaration of affection, or even acceptance in the way the world understood it. It was a statement of fact, of a boundary drawn. And within that boundary, however stark, she and her children were, for now, sheltered. That evening, back at the cabin, the silence felt different again. Elias carved a small, rough-looking dog, its head cocked as if listening. He left it on the hearth. Tom picked it up, a slow smile spreading across his face. Ilara watched them, a fragile tendril of hope, so long dormant, beginning to unfurl within her. The fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the deepening night. The wind outside seemed a little less mournful, a little less menacing. The seasons turned, the harsh beauty of autumn giving way to the stark, unforgiving grip of winter. Snow fell, blanketing the land in a silent shroud, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and isolating. The small cabin became their entire world, a haven of meager warmth against the biting cold. Elias's preparations for the winter had been thorough, almost obsessive. The woodpile was immense, stacked high against the cabin wall. Sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat filled a small root cellar he had dug beneath the floorboards. He hunted with a quiet intensity, bringing back deer and rabbit, ensuring their survival through the lean months. His foresight was their lifeline. Inside the cabin, life narrowed to the essentials. The fire was never allowed to die. Its flickering light was their constant companion, warding off the encroaching darkness and the bone-chilling cold. Ilara learned to bake a heavy, dense bread in a cast iron pot nestled in the embers. She mended their clothes, patching patches, her fingers growing nimble despite the chill that always seemed to linger in the corners of the room. The children, confined indoors for long stretches, grew restless. Tom practiced with a small bow and arrow Elias had fashioned for him, shooting at targets drawn on pieces of bark. Sarah, with scraps of cloth Ilara gave her, made clothes for the wooden bird Elias had carved, her small face serious with concentration. One particularly harsh evening, with a blizzard raging outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, Sarah fell ill. A fever burned in her small body, her breathing shallow and ragged. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Ilara's heart. They had no medicine, no access to a doctor. Elias watched Sarah's labored breathing, his face grim. He didn't speak, but he stoked the fire high, then disappeared into the storm, returning some time later covered in snow, his hands raw with cold, clutching a handful of willow bark and some dried herbs Ilara didn't recognize. He brewed a bitter tea, forcing small sips between Sarah's parched lips. He sat with her through the night, bathing her forehead with cool water, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he checked her temperature. Ilara sat beside him, a silent, anxious vigil. In those long, dark hours, watching him tend to her daughter with such focused, unflinching care, something shifted definitively within Ilara. This silent, solitary man, bound to them by a desperate bargain, was showing a depth of compassion she had never anticipated. It wasn't born of duty, or pity. It was something more elemental, a fierce protectiveness that resonated with her own maternal instincts. By morning, Sarah's fever had broken. Her breathing was easier, her color returning to normal. Relief washed over Ilara, so potent it left her weak. Elias, his face etched with fatigue, merely nodded when she whispered her thanks, then went about his morning chores as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had. A bond, forged in shared hardship and silent care, had deepened. It was unspoken, yet undeniable. As the winter progressed, Ilara found herself observing Elias more closely, noticing the small things, the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when Tom managed to hit a target with his bow, the slight hesitation before he ate, as if ensuring they had enough. She saw the deep lines of sorrow that framed his mouth, the haunted look that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She knew, without words, that he carried his own profound losses. One afternoon, when a rare break in the storms allowed a pale sun to illuminate the snow-covered landscape, Ilara bundled the children warmly and took them outside. Near the edge of the woods, under a tall, solitary pine, were two simple wooden crosses, weathered and grey. Elias's wife and child. She had sensed their presence long before she saw the markers. She stood before them for a long moment, the children quiet beside her. She didn't know their names, their stories. But she felt their ghosts, a silent testament to the grief that shaped the man who had given them shelter. She reached out and brushed a dusting of snow from one of the crosses. It was a small, instinctive gesture of acknowledgement, of shared humanity. When they returned to the cabin, Elias was there, mending a snowshoe. He glanced at their snow-dusted clothes, then at Ilara's face. His expression was unreadable. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. But a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of the sorrows that lay buried beneath the snow, and the fragile lives that persisted above it. The long winter days were punctuated by small, almost imperceptible shifts. Tom, growing bolder, started to follow Elias on his shorter treks, learning to read tracks in the snow, to identify the calls of winter birds. Elias didn't explicitly teach him, but he allowed the boy to accompany him, answering his occasional questions with curt, practical explanations. Sarah, her shyness slowly receding, would sometimes hum softly as she played, a tentative melody in the quiet cabin. Ilara herself began to feel a sense of belonging, not to a master, as her desperate words had proclaimed, but to this place, to this small, unlikely family forged in the crucible of hardship. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overlaid now with a fragile sense of security, a quiet defiance against the harshness of the world. The fire crackled. The wind soughed through the pines. And within the small log walls, for lives, once broken and adrift, were slowly, painstakingly, beginning to mend. The thaw came late that year, a slow, reluctant surrender of winter's icy dominion. The snow receded, revealing the bruised and sodden earth, and the streams swelled with meltwater, their voices loud and insistent. With the returning warmth came a renewed sense of unease. The isolation of winter had been a shield, the open paths of spring felt like an exposure. The town, and its judgments, felt closer. One morning, Mayor Thorne himself rode up to the cabin, accompanied by two grim-faced deputies. He didn't dismount, his bulk considerable on the sweating horse. His gaze swept over the cabin, lingering on Ilara as she stood in the doorway, Tom and Sarah half hidden behind her skirts. Elias emerged from the small barn where he'd been mending harnesses, his movements unhurried, his face a stony mask. "Thorne," Elias said, his voice flat. It wasn't a greeting. "Elias," the mayor replied, his tone officious. "We've had concerns. Reports. About this woman. About the children." His eyes flicked towards Ilara, dismissive and accusatory. "Preacher Gideon speaks of unnatural living. Of a situation that cannot be countenanced by a decent community." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between the mayor and the cabin door. He didn't speak, merely stood there, an immovable object. His stillness was more potent than any threat. "The council has decided, Elias," the mayor continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, though a flicker of uncertainty showed in his eyes. "For the good of the town, and for the welfare of these children, they need to be relocated. Placed in proper care, proper care." Ilara's voice, when it came, startled them all, including herself. It was stronger than she expected, raw with a fury that had been simmering for months. She stepped out from behind Elias, pushing the children gently behind her. "You call the scorn of your town proper care? The starvation you offered us?" Mayor Thorne looked taken aback by her outburst. "Now, see here, woman." "No, you see," Ilara interrupted, her voice gaining strength, each word fueled by a protective fire. This man, she gestured towards Elias, took us in when your town would have seen us perish or be sold like cattle. He has sheltered us. He has fed us. He has shown my children more kindness than they have ever known from your decent communities. Her gaze swept over the deputies, then settled back on the mayor, unwavering. These children were terrified, and now they feel safe. They were hungry, and now they are fed. This is our home. Tom stepped out from behind her then, small but resolute, his gaze fixed on the mayor. He's good, Tom said, his voice clear and surprisingly loud. He teaches me things. He made me a bow. Sarah, clutching the wooden bird, peeked around Elara's skirt, her eyes wide but no longer filled with the abject terror of their first days. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. This is irregular, Elias. The law, the law. Elias finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft. Your law left them destitute. My law gives them sanctuary. He took another step forward, his hand moving almost casually to rest on the handle of the large hunting knife at his belt. They stay here with me. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Mayor Thorne's bluster seemed to deflate. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to Elara's defiant stance, to the two small children standing their ground. He saw not a cowering victim and a silent captor, but something else entirely, a family, however unconventional, united and fierce. This ain't over, Thorne, the mayor muttered, his authority undermined. But there was no conviction in his voice. He tugged on his reins, turning his horse. You'll hear from the council again. The deputies followed, casting nervous backward glances. They rode away, their departure far less imposing than their arrival. Elara watched them go, her breath coming in shaky gasps, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. She felt Elias's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she saw something beyond the stoicism, beyond the sorrow. A flicker of something akin to pride, perhaps, or a shared victory. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his calloused fingers brushing briefly against her arm. It was the lightest of touches, yet it spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. They had faced the town, together, and they had stood firm. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and the familiar quiet settled over the cabin, Elias was carving. He wasn't making a toy this time. He was shaping a piece of darker, harder wood. Elara watched him, a sense of peace settling over her, a peace hard-won and precious. He worked for a long time, the scrape of the knife a soothing sound. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved flower, a wild rose, its petals delicate, its stem strong. Elara took it, her fingers trembling slightly. It was beautiful. More than beautiful. It was a promise. A symbol of resilience, of beauty found in a harsh land. She looked up at him, her heart full. Thank you, Elias, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. Elara, he said, speaking her name as if it were a new and precious thing. The wind sighed outside, no longer mournful, but carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the promise of spring. The fire burned bright, a beacon of warmth and defiance. In the small cabin, surrounded by the vast wilderness, a family had been forged, not by blood, nor by law, but by shared hardship, by unspoken kindness, and by the fierce, unyielding will to protect what was theirs. They had found their peace, a defiant peace, earned in the heart of the storm. And it was enough. It was everything.